She sat across from me, smiling politely, then laughed, soft, controlled, but sharp enough to cut. In front of everyone, she reduced my life to something small, something embarrassing. What she did not know was that every store around us, every light above her head, every inch of that place belonged to me. And I let her keep talking. Because sometimes the fastest way to see who someone truly is to let them believe you are nothing. And that night, she showed me exactly who she was. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 62 years old, and most mornings you will find me standing behind a small fruit stand near the west entrance of Sunridge Galleria Mall in Scottsdale, Arizona. People who pass by see an older woman arranging apples, wiping down peaches, and greeting regular customers with a quiet smile. To them, I am simply part of the background, as familiar and unremarkable as the tiled floors beneath their feet. I arrive before most of the stores open. The air inside the mall still carries the faint scent of cleaning solution mixed with something softer, something citrus and sweet from the crates I unpack. I take my time placing each piece of fruit where it belongs. Rows matter. Order matters. There is a kind of peace and repetition that I have come to rely on. Some mornings, a young mother will stop to buy strawberries for her children. Other times, an office worker grabs a banana on the way to a long day. They thank me, sometimes they linger, and sometimes they do not notice me at all. I do not mind either way. There is comfort in being overlooked. Most people assume I am here because I need the money. I have heard it whispered more than once, usually by those who believe I cannot hear them. They see my hands, a little rough from years of work, and they draw their conclusions. I have never corrected them. There is a certain freedom in letting people believe what they want. This stand is not just a job. It is where my life began. Decades ago, before this mall existed, before the polished glass storefronts and glowing signs, there was nothing here but a stretch of dry land and a few struggling vendors. One of them was me, and beside me, every single day, was my husband, Thomas. We started with a wooden cart he built himself. We would wake before sunrise, drive across town to buy produce, and spend long hours hoping to sell enough to get by. Some days were better than others, but Thomas never lost his belief that we were building something larger than what we could see. Years passed. We saved carefully, took risks others warned us against, and slowly turned that small cart into a store. Then that store into something bigger. What stands here now, this entire mall, grew from those early decisions, from sleepless nights and stubborn faith. When Thomas passed away, the world became very quiet for a while. There were meetings, documents, responsibilities I could not avoid. In the end, everything we had built was left in my hands. Sunridge Galleria Mall, every store, every lease, every floor above and below, belonged to me. I never announced it. I never saw a reason to. Instead, I came back here, to the fruit stand, because this is where I remember who we were before success complicated everything. This is where I can still see people clearly, without the distortion that money brings. My son Ethan grew up around this place. He remembers the fruit, the long days, the simple life we lived. What he does not know is the full extent of what his father and I created. I chose not to tell him. I wanted him to build his own path without leaning on something he did not earn. For a long time, that choice felt right. Life was steady, predictable, honest, at least. It was, until the day Ethan told me he wanted me to meet someone. If you're still watching, and this story has already sparked your curiosity, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what seemed like a simple life is about to reveal something far deeper. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. When Ethan told me he wanted me to meet someone, I remember standing behind the fruit stand with a peach in my hand, turning it slowly as if it might give me an answer. He sounded different on the phone that night. There was a careful excitement in his voice, something steadier than the casual relationships he had mentioned in the past. I knew, before I even met her, that this time was not the same. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. I told myself it was just another day, but I still wiped down the counter twice, rearranged the apples until they sat in perfect rows, and replaced a few strawberries that were not quite as fresh as the others. I even brought a small bundle of white flowers and set them near the register. It had been years since I cared about first impressions, but this felt different. This was someone who mattered to my son. Around noon, I saw Ethan walking toward me from across the mall. He moved with a lightness I had not seen in a long time. Beside him was a woman who seemed to belong to a different world entirely. She was tall, composed, and dressed with a kind of effortless precision that suggested she understood exactly how she wanted to be seen. Her posture was straight, her steps measured, and everything about her appearance felt intentional. As they approached, Ethan smiled the way he used to when he was younger, open and unguarded. He introduced her, and she greeted me with a polite warmth that sounded practiced rather than natural. Her voice was smooth, controlled, and perfectly measured. There was nothing overtly unkind about it, yet something in it felt distant. What stayed with me was not what she said, but what she did. Before her eyes settled on me, they moved across the fruit stand, slowly, carefully. She looked at the wooden shelves, the arrangement of the fruit, the handwritten price board, and the crates stacked neatly behind me. Her gaze lingered just long enough on each detail to suggest she was not simply noticing, but evaluating. Then, almost as an afterthought, she looked at my hands. I noticed the exact moment her expression changed. It was brief, barely there, but it was enough. The kind of shift you only recognize if you have spent years sitting across tables from people negotiating more than they admit. It was not curiosity. It was assessment. I smiled anyway. Ethan began telling her stories about how he used to help me at the stand when he was a child. His voice carried warmth, even pride, but she only listened halfway. Her attention drifted beyond us, toward the rest of the mall. I watched her eyes move from one store to another, pausing slightly longer at the high-end boutiques, the polished storefronts, the places where money spoke without needing to introduce itself. Then she asked how long I had been working there. I answered simply, and she nodded in a way that suggested she was filing the information away for later. There was a softness to her expression, but it did not reach her eyes. When she spoke again, there was a faint disbelief hidden beneath her politeness, as if she could not quite understand why someone would remain in a place like this for so long. Ethan did not notice any of it. He stood beside her, relaxed, comfortable, happy in a way that made me want to believe everything was fine. I wanted to see her the way he did. I truly did. But I have spent too many years reading people to ignore what was right in front of me. She was not just looking at me. She was measuring me. And in that moment, I felt something settle quietly in my chest, something I could not yet name, but could not dismiss. That was the moment I knew something was not right. If you're still here and starting to sense that something isn't quite right, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Because that first impression was only the beginning. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa became a steady presence in Ethan's life, and gradually in mine. At first, her visits felt occasional, almost incidental, as if she were simply accompanying him out of politeness. But over time, those visits grew more frequent, and with them, something else began to change. She remained polite. That was the first thing anyone would notice. Her tone never crossed into anything openly rude, and her words were always wrapped in a kind of careful consideration. But politeness, I had learned long ago, could be a very effective disguise. It started with small comments, almost easy to overlook if you were not paying attention. She would glance at the crates of fruit and ask whether I ever thought about slowing down. She would remark on the long hours, suggesting that someone my age should not have to work so much anymore. The words themselves were harmless on the surface, but there was always something beneath them, something unspoken that lingered in the air after she finished. I did not respond to those comments directly. Instead, I listened. One afternoon, Ethan came by alone. That alone was unusual. He leaned against the counter, picking up an apple and turning it slowly in his hands without really looking at it. There was a heaviness in his posture that had not been there before. I poured him a cup of lemonade the way I used to when he was younger. He took it with a quiet thank you, but his attention seemed elsewhere. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a hesitation I recognized immediately. He mentioned that Vanessa thought I worked too much. The statement was simple, but the pause that followed it said more than the words themselves. I asked him gently whether she believed I needed help. He answered quickly, but not convincingly. It was not concern that troubled me. It was the way concern had been shaped into something else. Later that same day, Vanessa returned with him. Her expression was warm, her smile perfectly placed, but the conversation did not take long to return to familiar ground. She asked again if I had ever considered retiring, this time more directly. There was no hesitation in her voice now, only a quiet certainty. I asked her what she believed I should do instead. She suggested something less physical, something more suitable. The phrase lingered longer than she intended. Suitable for what? I wondered. For my age? Or for her expectations? Ethan shifted beside her, uncomfortable, but he did not interrupt. Then she mentioned something new. People were asking questions, she said. His colleagues, his social circle. They were curious about his background, about his family. She did not say the word embarrassed, but it hovered just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. I watched Ethan carefully. He avoided my eyes. That was the moment I understood that this was no longer just about her opinions. It was about influence, about shaping how my son saw the world, and how he believed the world saw him. Vanessa was not raising her voice. She did not need to. Her confidence carried her message clearly enough. She spoke about the future, about opportunities, about moving into better circles. Each phrase was carefully chosen, each suggestion placed exactly where it would have the most impact. And slowly, almost quietly, I realized something that could not be ignored. She was not asking me to change. She was positioning me to disappear. I felt no anger in that moment, only clarity. I had seen this kind of thinking before, in boardrooms and negotiations where people believed success gave them the right to redefine everything around them. So, I made a decision. I would not argue. I would not defend myself. I would watch. Because people always reveal who they truly are when they believe no one is paying attention. If you're still watching and you can feel the tension building, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Because what looks like concern is slowly turning into something much more serious. Now let's move on to chapter 4. After that day, I stopped trying to convince myself that I might be wrong about Vanessa. There is a point in life when experience replaces doubt, and I had passed that point many years ago. I had seen ambition before. I had worked with it, negotiated with it, and sometimes lost sleep because of it. What I was seeing now was not unfamiliar. It was simply closer to home. Vanessa no longer hid her curiosity behind polite questions. She had grown more comfortable, more certain, and with that confidence came a shift in how she spoke and what she chose to ask. Her attention was no longer divided between me and the fruit stand. It had moved beyond that, outward, toward the structure surrounding us. She began asking about the mall itself. At first, the question sounded casual. She would comment on how busy certain stores seemed, or how the layout of the building encouraged foot traffic. Then the questions became more specific. She wanted to know how long tenants typically stayed, which locations were the most valuable, and how ownership was structured in a place like this. I answered only what was necessary, nothing more. When she walked through the mall with Ethan, I watched her from a distance. She moved differently than most visitors. She did not wander. She studied. Her eyes traced the lines of the building, the positioning of storefronts, the flow of people. She paused longer in front of luxury brands, not to admire them, but to evaluate their presence. To her, this was not a place filled with memories. It was an asset. Ethan followed beside her, listening, occasionally nodding, but I could see the difference between them. He saw the mall the way he always had, as a familiar space, a part of his upbringing. Vanessa saw something else entirely. She saw potential, leverage, opportunity waiting to be claimed. It did not take long before the conversation turned toward real estate. One afternoon, while I was arranging a fresh delivery of oranges, she mentioned that she and Ethan had started looking at properties. Her tone carried a sense of excitement, but also urgency. She spoke about the importance of timing, about making the right move before opportunities disappeared. Then she mentioned the penthouse units above the mall. She described them in detail, from the height of the ceilings to the view across the city skyline. It was not admiration. It was calculation. She spoke as if she had already imagined herself living there, as if the only missing piece was access. Ethan hesitated when she spoke about it. I noticed the way he shifted his weight, the way his voice softened when he tried to explain that it might not be realistic. Vanessa listened, but she did not accept his hesitation. She reframed it, gently but persistently, as something temporary, something that could be overcome. What she believed, I realized, was not based on what Ethan had told her. It was based on what she had assumed. A few days later, that assumption became clearer. Through one of the property managers who reported directly to me, I learned that Vanessa had contacted a real estate agent connected to the building. She had inquired about purchasing one of the penthouse units. Not renting, purchasing. She had also asked about ownership approval, about how decisions were made, about who held the final authority. That alone would have been enough, but there was more. She had used her professional network to access partial property records, trying to identify the ownership structure behind the mall. She had not found my name. Few people ever did, but she had discovered enough to confirm her suspicion. She believed there was hidden wealth tied to Ethan's family. I sat quietly in my office after hearing that, looking out over the mall we had built, and felt something settle into place. Not anger, not even surprise, clarity. Vanessa was not guessing anymore. She was moving with intention. And so, I made a decision. I would not stop her. I would not correct her assumptions or interrupt her progress. People like Vanessa reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are getting closer to what they want. She thought she was climbing toward an opportunity. She did not realize she was walking straight toward me. If you're still here and you think you understand what she's really after, comment number 4 below. But trust me, the truth is bigger than you think. Now let's move on to chapter 5. The invitation came a few days later, delivered in a tone that suggested importance without saying it directly. Vanessa's parents wanted to host a family dinner. The location she chose did not surprise me. The rooftop restaurant inside the mall had always been a place where people came to be seen as much as to dine. It offered a sweeping view of the city, soft lighting, and the quiet confidence of a place that knew its own value. When I arrived that evening, the setting felt almost staged. Glass walls reflected the golden lights of the city below, and the air carried a calm elegance that made every movement seem deliberate. Vanessa and her parents were already seated. Ethan stood when he saw me, his smile warm but slightly tense, as if he sensed something he could not yet name. The conversation began pleasantly enough. We spoke about work, about the city, about small things that did not matter. Vanessa carried herself with ease, guiding the discussion without appearing to control it. Her parents listened carefully, occasionally adding comments that reinforced a shared understanding of status and expectation. It did not take long for the conversation to shift. Vanessa introduced the topic of real estate with practiced casualness. She spoke about properties she had seen, about the value of location, about the importance of making the right investment at the right time. Her voice carried enthusiasm, but also intention. Each sentence felt placed, as though she were building towards something. Then she mentioned the penthouse units above the mall. She described them in detail, the view, the space, the exclusivity. Her eyes brightened as she spoke, not with admiration, but with certainty. To her, it was not a possibility. It was an expectation waiting to be fulfilled. Ethan shifted in his chair. I noticed the way his hand moved slightly toward his glass, the way he avoided meeting my eyes. He tried to redirect the conversation once, but Vanessa continued, gently but firmly guiding it back. Then she connected everything. She spoke about Ethan's background, about the history of the mall, about the idea that opportunities often come from where you begin. Her words were careful, but the meaning was clear. She believed there was something more beneath the surface, something she intended to reach. When she finally turned her attention to me, the room seemed to grow quieter. She spoke about my work, about the fruit stand, about how long I had been there. Her tone remained polite, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, no longer hidden. She framed it as concern, as practicality, as something that needed to be addressed for the sake of the future. Then came the words that settled everything. She suggested that sometimes people needed to recognize when it was time to step aside so that others could move forward properly. She spoke about environments, about expectations, about the importance of presenting the right image in the right circles. And then, with a small, almost dismissive laugh, she said that selling fruit was not the kind of legacy that opened doors. The table fell silent. Ethan looked down, his expression tightening in a way I had never seen before. Vanessa's parents did not interrupt. They simply watched, their interest sharpened by what was unfolding. Vanessa herself remained composed, unaware that she had crossed a line she could not step back from. I felt no anger. Instead, I felt something far more steady, a kind of clarity that comes when every uncertainty disappears at once. Everything I had observed, every small moment, every quiet calculation had led to this. I placed my hands lightly on the table and looked at her, not as someone offended, but as someone who finally understood exactly who she was. There was nothing left to question. Slowly, without raising my voice or changing my expression, I reached into my purse and took out my phone. That was the moment I knew the truth no longer needed to stay hidden. I could feel the stillness settle over the table the moment I placed my phone on the surface in front of me. No one spoke. Even the soft hum of conversation from nearby tables seemed distant, as though the room itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next. I made the call calmly, without explanation. My voice remained steady, my tone unchanged. I asked for a brief moment of someone's time, nothing more. When I ended the call, I returned the phone to my purse and folded my hands in front of me as if nothing unusual had happened. Vanessa watched me with a faint smile, the kind people wear when they believe they are still in control. To her, this was a minor interruption, something that would pass without consequence. Ethan, however, looked at me differently. There was uncertainty in his eyes now, a quiet awareness that something was shifting beneath the surface. It did not take long. Within a minute, I saw him approaching from across the restaurant floor. The senior manager moved quickly but without panic, his posture composed, his attention focused. When he reached our table, he did not look at Vanessa or her parents. He looked at me. He greeted me with quiet respect, addressing me formally. That was the moment everything changed. Vanessa's expression flickered, just briefly. Confusion replaced confidence for the first time since I had met her. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair, his gaze moving between us as if trying to understand what he was seeing. I did not raise my voice. I did not change my posture. I simply asked a question. I asked him who owned the mall. It was a simple question, one that could have been answered in a dozen different ways, but the answer he gave was precise. He explained the ownership structure, the company behind it, and then, without hesitation, he stated the truth. I was the primary owner. The words settled over the table with a weight that could not be ignored. Ethan stared at me, as though he had never seen me before. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to something deeper, something that carried both realization and uncertainty. Vanessa did not react immediately. For a second, she remained perfectly still, as if her mind had paused in place. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before, edged with disbelief. She looked at the manager, searching for correction, for any sign that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. He remained composed, his answer unchanged. I met her gaze and confirmed it without emphasis, without pride, without apology. The truth did not require decoration. Ethan asked how it was possible, his voice unsteady. I told him what I had always told him, just not in full. His father and I had built this place. Over time, ownership had consolidated. After his father passed, the responsibility became mine. I explained it simply, because to me, it had always been simple. What complicated things was not the truth itself, but how people reacted to it. Vanessa leaned back slowly, her earlier confidence gone. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the rapid shift as she tried to reorganize everything she thought she understood. The image she had built no longer held. Then I told her something else. I mentioned that I was aware of the inquiries made about the penthouse units. I told her that I knew her company had been exploring acquisition opportunities within the mall. I did not accuse her. I did not need to. The connection was obvious. For the first time, she had no response prepared. The composure she had carried so carefully began to fracture, not dramatically, but enough to reveal what lay beneath it. The room remained quiet. Ethan said nothing. Her parents said nothing. Even the staff kept their distance, sensing that this was not a moment to interrupt. I did not press further. There was nothing left to prove. I had not raised my voice. I had not defended myself. I had simply allowed the truth to take its place in the conversation. And in that silence, the balance of everything shifted. For the first time since I met her, Vanessa had nothing left to say. If you're still watching after that reveal, comment number 6 below, because everything has just changed, but the real consequences are only beginning. Now, let's move on to chapter 7. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It lingered, stretching across the table in a way that made every movement feel heavier than it should have been. The soft clink of glass from another table, the distant murmur of conversation, the quiet footsteps of staff moving across the polished floor, all of it continued as if nothing had happened. And yet, at our table, everything had changed. Ethan sat very still. He was not looking at me anymore. His gaze had shifted, settling somewhere between Vanessa and the empty space in front of him. I could almost see the thoughts moving through his mind, one after another, connecting moments he had not questioned before. Small things, conversations, expressions, pieces that had once seemed harmless now forming a clearer picture. Vanessa tried to speak, but the confidence she had carried earlier was gone. What remained was something more fragile, something uncertain. Her voice, when it finally came, was softer, less controlled. She attempted to explain, to reshape what had been said into something more acceptable, something that could still be defended. But explanations, I had learned, lose their strength when they arrive too late. I did not interrupt her. I did not challenge her. I simply listened. Her parents shifted in their seats, their posture no longer relaxed. There was a careful awareness in the way they looked at me now, a quiet recalibration that did not need to be spoken aloud. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Respect had replaced assumption, not because of who I was as a person, but because of what they now knew. That difference mattered. Ethan finally moved, leaning back slightly as if trying to create space between himself and everything that had just unfolded. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years of watching him struggle to process something he could not easily accept. He looked at Vanessa, but not the way he had before. There was distance there now, not anger, not yet, but something quieter and more difficult to repair. Doubt had taken its place, and doubt has a way of reshaping everything it touches. Vanessa seemed to sense it. She turned toward him, her expression shifting again, this time searching for reassurance, but the certainty she expected was no longer there. Ethan did not respond the way she needed him to. He did not reach for her hand. He did not step in to smooth over the moment. He remained still. And in that stillness, something important began to take shape. I watched him carefully, not as a businesswoman evaluating a situation, but as a mother recognizing a change in her son. There are moments in life when understanding arrives quietly, without announcement. This was one of them. Vanessa continued speaking, her words circling back on themselves, trying to soften what had already been said. She framed her intentions as concern, as ambition, as a desire to build something better. But the meaning behind those words no longer carried the same weight. Once something has been revealed, it cannot be hidden again. I felt no need to respond. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory. What I felt instead was a quiet confirmation of something I had already understood. People show you who they are, not in the moments when they are careful, but in the moments when they believe they are safe to be honest, and Vanessa had believed she was safe. The restaurant continued around us, unchanged. Plates were served, conversations resumed, laughter rose and fell in distant corners of the room. Life moved forward, indifferent to the shift that had just taken place at one small table near the edge of the city lights. But for us, nothing was the same. Ethan's silence said more than any words could have. It was not empty. It was full of realization, of questions he had not yet asked, of answers he was only beginning to understand. And as I watched him sit there, no longer looking at Vanessa the way he once had, I knew that something far more important than embarrassment had taken root. Trust had begun to unravel. In that silence, I could see the moment my son began to understand everything. That night did not end with raised voices or dramatic exits. It ended quietly, in a way that felt heavier than any argument could have been. By the time I returned to the fruit stand the next morning, the mall had already settled into its usual rhythm. People moved through the corridors with the same purpose they always had, unaware that anything had shifted. But I knew it had. Ethan found me just after noon. I saw him before he reached the stand. His walk was slower than usual, his posture slightly withdrawn, as though he were carrying something he had not yet figured out how to set down. When he stopped in front of me, he did not speak right away. He simply looked at the rows of fruit, the same way he used to when he was younger, as if the familiarity might help him find his place again. I handed him a small paper cup of lemonade. He took it without hesitation, but his attention remained somewhere else. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. He asked me why I had never told him the truth, not about the business, not about the scale of what his father and I had built. I answered him the same way I had always answered myself, because it never felt necessary. I told him that I wanted him to build his life without leaning on something he did not earn. I wanted him to know what it meant to work towards something without the safety of knowing it would be given to him. Money has a way of changing people, not always in obvious ways, but in quiet ones that are harder to undo. He listened without interrupting. I could see the shift happening in him, the slow movement from confusion toward understanding. He began to speak again, not to argue, but to think out loud. He mentioned things Vanessa had said, moments he had dismissed at the time, conversations that now sounded different when he replayed them in his mind. He was not angry, not yet. He was disappointed. And disappointment, I have learned, is far more enduring. After a long pause, he asked me something else. His voice was quieter this time, more careful. He asked what would happen to everything one day. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I told him the truth. Nothing would happen automatically. Ownership was not something that passed simply because of blood. It was a responsibility, and responsibility had to be earned. I had made that decision a long time ago, not out of distrust, but out of belief. The person who would one day take control of what we built needed to understand its value, not just financially, but personally. He absorbed that slowly. For the first time, I could see that he was no longer thinking in terms of what he might receive. He was thinking about who he needed to be. That was the difference. I did not tell him what to do about Vanessa. That was not my place. Instead, I told him something simpler, that people reveal who they are when they believe there is nothing to gain, that the absence of advantage often shows more truth than its presence. He nodded, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood the question. We stood there for a while longer, surrounded by the quiet movement of the mall, the same place that had shaped so much of his life without him ever fully realizing it. When he finally stepped away, there was still uncertainty in his expression, but there was something else now as well, something steadier. For the first time, his future was not something he could inherit. It was something he had to choose. If you're still here and wondering what choice will be made, comment number 8 below to stay until the end, because the final decision will define everything. Now, let's move on to the conclusion. The day after our conversation at the fruit stand, I did not see Ethan right away. That in itself told me more than anything he could have said. He had always been someone who processed things internally before speaking, and I knew he would not rush a decision that mattered this much. By late afternoon, the mall had settled into its usual rhythm again, but I found myself noticing the quiet spaces between movements. Those moments where people paused, where thoughts lingered just beneath the surface. It reminded me of how change rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly, and then everything shifts around it. I learned later that Ethan met Vanessa that evening at their apartment. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. What happened between them was something far more difficult to repair. He spoke calmly. That was what struck me the most when he told me about it afterward. There was no anger in his words, only a steady clarity that had not been there before. He told her what he had come to understand, not just about the dinner, but about everything that had led to it. He spoke about the way she had looked at me, the way she had spoken about my work, and the way she had framed his future as something that needed to be elevated beyond where it began. He did not accuse her. He simply described what he had seen. Vanessa tried to explain. She said she had only been thinking about their future, that she wanted them to have more, to move forward, to build something better. But in doing so, she revealed the same pattern he had begun to recognize. Everything she described was tied to what could be gained, not what already existed. Ethan listened, but he no longer accepted those explanations the way he once might have. Something in him had shifted. He understood now that intention does not erase impact, and that respect cannot depend on circumstance. He told her that he could not ignore what he had seen, that the way she viewed his mother, and by extension his past, was not something he could separate from the future she claimed to want. It was all connected. There was a long pause after that. He did not end things completely. That was not his way, but he made it clear that he needed space, time to think, time to understand whether what they had built was real or simply shaped by expectation. When he told me all of this, he did not look relieved. He looked steady, and that, more than anything, told me he had made the right choice. Vanessa, for the first time since I had known her, was no longer in control of the direction things were taking. The certainty she had relied on had been replaced by uncertainty, and there was nothing she could do to change that immediately. I did not ask Ethan what would happen next. That was not my place. What mattered was that he had begun to see clearly. For the first time, he was no longer choosing between two people. He was choosing who he wanted to become. A few weeks passed, and life settled back into something that looked familiar on the surface. Each morning, I returned to the fruit stand, arranging apples and peaches the same way I always had. The rhythm of the mall continued without interruption. People came and went, conversations drifted through the air, and nothing outwardly suggested that anything had changed. But I knew better. Ethan still visited, though differently now. There was a quiet steadiness in him that had not been there before. He no longer rushed through conversations or avoided certain topics. Instead, he listened more, spoke less, and carried himself with a sense of awareness that only comes from seeing something clearly for the first time. He had taken distance from Vanessa. There was no dramatic ending, no final scene that closed the door completely, just space. And sometimes, space reveals more truth than confrontation ever could. I did not ask for details. I did not need to. What mattered was not the outcome, but the change. As for Vanessa, her absence said enough. Some lessons do not arrive with consequences that can be measured. They arrive quietly, in the form of lost certainty, of plans that no longer fit the reality they were built on. I continued my work at the stand, not because I had to, but because I chose to. This place still reminded me of where everything began, of what mattered before success complicated the picture. Looking back, I felt no anger, only clarity, because in the end, nothing truly changed. The truth had always been there. It had simply been unseen. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is this. People do not show you who they are when they have everything. They show you who they are when they believe you have nothing. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters, not through grand moments or loud confrontations, but through the subtle ways people choose to act when they believe no one is watching or when they believe there is nothing to gain. It is in those moments that character becomes visible, stripped of performance and expectation. Success, status, and appearance may shape how the world sees us, but they do not define who we are. True value is found in humility, in respect, and in the ability to remain grounded regardless of circumstance. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in proving your worth, but in allowing others to reveal theirs. If this story resonated with you, thank you for being here. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more meaningful stories.